This one's for Professor Green. Is Brad Green, right? Yeah.
Brad.
Brad.
Yep.
What do you think is the significance of the temptation of specifically knowledge that Satan gave to Eve to deceive her? Because he could have said, you could have this power that God has, or you could have the authority, but like it was specifically, what he used to draw her in was, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And I guess, as you were talking about in your talk, what does that say about us innately? Are we innately, as humans, attracted to knowledge? I don't know. And why wasn't another, I guess, aspect of God's character kind of used to entice us to sin in that way?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And so since we've got the whole seminar could be done on that question, let me give my short answer. I think one way to think about the question of knowledge with the serpent and Eve is that God had already given revelation, right? So God's already spoken before the fall, because otherwise they couldn't have sinned against that spoken revelation from Genesis 2. And so Eve's decision, one way of thinking about Eve's decision when the serpent speaks to her is she already has God's revelation about reality and what is expected. The first couple are to exercise dominion, subdue, work, and keep the garden. And there's the one prohibition. Here's, you had one job, right? Here's the one thing you cannot do. And that's the only prohibition given that we have in Scripture up until this date. So if you think about knowledge, one way to think about what happens to Eve is she has to decide, do I trust God's interpretation of reality, or do I trust my own, being influenced by the serpent or the evil? It's clearly the serpent, the evil one, the devil, as we look at the rest of the canon. So as far as knowledge, I'll just suggest this is, the Eve has to decide, do I trust God's revelation, or do I engage in a kind of epistemological autonomy, right? Do I trust my own hunch? Do I trust the evil one as he seduces me? I don't think it's a sexual seduction, but it's an intellectual seduction. And that's in a sense that's the temptation for every student, right? And it's the challenge in what's, I love Cambridge, but it is a de facto radically secular university. I think we'd all agree here, right? You have to decide, do I trust, as I engage in my intellectual disciplines, that revelation might have something to bear on how I think about all of reality? Or do I go with a de facto secular approach to knowledge? And I think that's, in a sense, our echo of Eve's temptation.
Can I add something? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so also the idea, it's not about knowing, how something works. It's about knowing good and evil. And I think that's part of, I love that you use the word autonomy, because think about the people and our culture, they want to define, it's not just knowing good and evil. They want to be able to be the ones who decide what's good and what's evil. And I think that was the temptation. And so understanding the difference between knowing and taking control over that knowledge is another part of it.
Great. We can take some more questions from the crowd.
Hello. This question is directed more towards Professor Karen. I really like about what you shared about the recognizing the unrecognized needs in teaching. And personally, I do teach a undergraduate tutorial class, and then I kind of see the attendance number dwindle across weeks. And sometimes I can't help but to think that, do they think they're not getting anything out of my class? That's why they're not coming? But yeah, how will you wrestle with that, practically speaking? Yeah, thank you.
Well, again, it's part of the first thing you have to do is to pray that what you are saying is getting through, because there is that third in the conversation, and just rest that that's what's happening. I mean, it is, you do have to work at it, and you do have to keep asking them, in various ways. If they're understanding, have them reflect back to you. We talk about active listening, which is when we reflect to them what we have heard them say. Get them to reflect back to you what they have heard you say, and how they have come to understand whatever it is that you're getting them. And they'll teach you how they need to be taught. Does that make sense? To say that, I mean, we teach others how to treat us. And if you're attentive to how they're responding to you, but you also have to ask them, don't make the mistake I did with that guy. You have to ask them to reflect back to you what they heard, because that will give you some clue as to, do I need to go further into this? Do I need to walk away from this? Or they've got it, let's move on. Those are the kinds of questions you have to ask them and get them to talk to you. It has to do with trust. What Cecilia was saying, build the relationships, build a relationship of trust where they feel free to say, I didn't understand a word you said. And I've had that. Students, you know, she's like, she uses big words. I don't understand what she's talking about. And I tell them, if I do that, you stop me, because I got other words. I could use those instead. Yeah, so.
That's good.
Hey, speaking of other words, can I just, I'm not gonna, well, you get this other person. I wanted to respond to the person who said, how will people know from looking at me that I'm living in another place? And I think part of it has to do, to recognize that you guys are from the no-chill generation, okay? You're anxious about everything. And I think that one of the ways that you can stand out as countercultural is to approach your work with joy and to rest in the, you know, it's rewrite that verse. I'm sorry, but come to me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will give you chill. That's important. That's important.
Since we're moving from one side of the panel to the other, I'm going to direct this question to Cecilia. I wondered whether you thought it was a useful activity to try and discern where God is leading you in the moment. You talked about only having those interactions with kind of Eastern Europe 40 years later. Given that you had those inclinations 40 years earlier, do you think it was worth kind of dwelling on those things in that moment? Or do you think that was something which you kind of shouldn't have done and should have just let God lead you as kind of things happened? So do you think it's worth kind of consciously thinking about where God might be taking you? Or is it a case of just acting in the moment and letting the process happen naturally?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think having a relationship with God and knowing him and knowing what he wants is a ever-changing kind of thing, isn't it? It's continuous. And I don't think I was wrong. I think, over 40 years ago, that was a very, very strong leading that he gave me. I carried on praying for the people throughout the 40 years. But I did not... some very, very experienced Christians, because in those days, they couldn't just take anyone who wanted to go. And so they met in a neutral country and they were praying. They put all the students who wanted to go to Eastern Europe into a hat, well, not quite into a hat, but then asked God specifically which ones would be safe to go. And they told me that they didn't want medics, they didn't want doctors, and I was training to be a doctor. They only wanted researchers because they had enough researchers. And I also felt that my motivation at that point was wrong. I wanted to die there. I was one of these really kind of, I just wanted to die for Jesus, this kind of martyr complex. And I think it would have been pride, really, that drove me. and it would have been wrong. And I think God just needed to beat all that out of me. Took him 40 years and more, of course, before I could be useful. So I think, no, keep on asking God. God will make it very, very clear. He made it, I mean, it was just miraculous. And we didn't think we would get that project. Well, we didn't think the European Union would be paying. The European Union has paid for all my trips to Central Europe in the past 3 years. And every time I go, I do evangelism as well as do my academic work. And I mean, God will make it very clear, but you do need patience. 40 years is a long time for many of you, I think.
That's great. We still have time for questions, so keep your hand raised if you have one. And then
Thank you so much for the talk. I believe as a Christian, we need to make most of what God has given us, like talents and time and everything. But how can I strive for excellency and be a good steward as at the same time acknowledging my limits and not judging myself in a worldly way?
Wow. Who wants to start with that one? It's a good one.
You need a song in your heart that that Amy Grant came out with 30 years ago that says, you know, I may not win everyone's hearts. All I ever have to be is what you've made me. And if you can hear that song in your heart when you know, so listen to Christian music, and the ones that resonate with you are those are the words that God is giving you. That all you ever have to be is what He's made you. So.
You're now my wife's best friend for quoting Amy Grant. So y'all need to have a talk after the session.
I could sing it. No, I'm just.
Hi, I like to hear anyone from who has insight about this question I asked. So I'm a PhD student, and there are various theories in academia. But when looking at the lives of certain scholars, some were anti-Christian, or their theories themselves stand in opposition to God. And as a researcher, I sometimes find that what I want to say aligns with their idea, yet I do not agree with their worldview. So this makes me question whether using such theories is truly Bible-based and how it reflects my overall positionality. So how should I view the use of non-biblical theories in my research? That's my current issues that I face now.
May I? Yeah.
Sure.
So it's a great, may I ask your field? Did you say your field? Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, that's perfect, because my example, my next talk is on linguistics. I mean, not that I'm a linguistic scholar, but I play one on TV. And so, American old commercial joke there. So it seems to me there's a couple ways to come at that. I'll keep this brief, John Calvin can speak about how God, through his common grace, even folks who've not come to faith or still have certain gifts, and they see things a certain way, and they can build things and understand things. With Calvin, I would say that at the end of the day, only the Christian can really account for why and how that is the case. So we can provide the theological substructure for why there's rationality and knowledge and understanding, why the world's real and not an illusion, why language is meaningful and not just about power, okay? So we can learn from whatever your Derridas or your critical theorist or whatever, or at least understand them. There is a time where people use language for power and to abuse, etc. But the Christian, at the end of the day, says the Christian can provide the reason the secularist makes some sense in a way the secularist's own worldview can't provide that. Does that make sense? We can explain the secularist worldview better than they can, is how I'd start to unpack it. I've taken my own stab at critical theory in a manuscript that'll come out next year, and we can point you to other materials, but that's how it starts.
And I can also, that was some of the stories I cut because I got my 5-minute warning, but this is in my wheelhouse. I mean, I read Derrida, I read Lacan. I mean, my first book's on Lacan. But the thing is, I ran across this thing in Augustine. It's like they have access to truth that isn't theirs.
Yeah.
Right? It's the truth. And so I do think, and so I was talking back to a professor who was being really critical. He was making straw men out of all of these critical theorists and say that they don't know anything. And I was like, yes, they do. They know exactly they are very good at describing what it means to live in a fallen world and have to use post-Babel language where we can't talk to each other. And even if we're using the same words, we're not hearing them the same way. But they are rubbish at prescriptions. And that's where it stops. And that's where we can appeal to the kinds of things the truths that are God-given, but we don't have to ignore the truths that are Foucault-given, some of them. But, you know, and there is room for all of that.
Yep. So someone's going after your soul if you're studying linguistics, to be frank. So I would feast on John, I would feast on Augustine, and I would avail yourself of the Christians, like Augustine, have been wrestling with articulating a biblical theology, the way language works, long before 20th century theorists like Derrida came along. And that's how I stumbled into Augustine, was he helped me to grasp that there's a Christian theological biblical way to think about language that does a deeper and better look at things than the Derridas, Foucaults, et cetera, do. So happy to talk more about resources.
Bakhtin, too. Bakhtin, there's Bakhtin and then there's Bakhtin that was taken up by the French atheists. And so when they say that third in a conversation is the language system, no. It's Bakhtin was talking about his Lord. So.
Thank you for all of your talks. But Karen, this question is for you. I was thinking back to what you said in your talk about how sometimes you love the subject more than your students. And that really resonated with me because as a former teacher and as someone who studies education, I hear all the time, we need to build relationships. We have to love the students, get to know your students, do that interest inventory at the beginning of each term. And it's all right if they don't understand the course content because they know that they're loved. And that's never quite sat well with me because I do want them to know the course content. I want them to be better readers, writers, thinkers, speakers than when they entered the room. So I'm wondering, how do we, maybe to borrow a Christopher Watkin term, diagonalize the twin poles of loving our students, but also maintaining that intellectual rigor and challenge that may sometimes require us to demand more of our students and to seem like we're not loving them when we expect more from them. I wonder if you have, or any of you on the panel have something to say to that.
I have to say I was really convicted by a lot of the things that Cecilia said. Build close relationships. But God has standards. And this is something that I was thinking about when we just went through our promotions committee, and one of my colleagues was like, I don't like playing God in people's lives. I said, well, first of all, you're not. You are entering into a conversation that God is already having, and you are evaluating according to a standard, and it's okay because God has standards. I think this is a Christian question between justice and mercy, and all of that comes through. It's not easy, and it's not supposed to be, but that's what That's why the most important thing is to keep your relationship with God at the forefront and trust what feels like intuition, but it's God's leading. It's the Holy Spirit's leading on these things. But yeah, you have to. Yeah.
May I just add that my students are medical students, and General Medical Council has standards. And I'm sure that you want your doctors to be qualified and that they know their content. I mean, I've had students who failed, and as Karen was saying, you build a relationship with them enough so that you can help them through that failure. And after that, in fact, there was one Christian student who failed. But, you know, after the resit exams and after working with her, you know, her faith was a lot stronger after that. So it is important. I mean, doctors must know their stuff.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you so much for all the talks. So I work within like the field of sociology of religion. And so this very frequently forces me to sort of be an external observer of a reality that I find that is very close to me. And so I was just wondering, how do you guard yourself from getting into this schizophrenia of like being an external observer and being a Christian and being a good scholar of like within this field? So I'd love to hear whatever you can say about that. Thank you.
I think I grasped the question. Can you say it one more time? I want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly.
Sure. Yeah. So like I'm working within sociology of religion. So very frequently I'm forced to look at like religious phenomena or churches or trends or spirituality. And I'm forced to be kind of an external observer of these things, but I'm also a Christian. So these things are obviously very close to me. And so sometimes I'm wondering how to maintain a correct attitude, be a good researcher, but also not be this, like you said, default secularist, and how to combine these things.
Yep. Well, I'll say something. I think it's difficult because there's almost a game you have to play or will end up playing if you're going to pass. And so I joke with persons, write your dissertation and then take that book and put all the stuff in you didn't think you could put in, you know, when you were writing it for your committee. And I'm only half joking when I say that. 'Cause yes, if you're at a Cambridge or whatever, you may not be able to be completely putting pen to paper on what you think about every single thing in light of a biblical worldview, right? But you can still think that way, right? You can still have that there. And you can, ethically, I think you would never want to write anything that's violating that, right? Or that's going against that. You would have to think, how much do I lay out for the committee, what I think about every single thing? And there is kind of a don't throw your pearl before swine's issue here, right? You don't have to pour your soul out about everything you think about your discipline to say a 2-3 person committee, maybe radically secular or something like this. But at a very basic level, I would say make sure you're practicing the spiritual disciplines. You're in a gospel preaching church. You've got accountability. You're not just kind of floating through this, because you will, if you're not grounded, things can go really badly for you spiritually. And so be wise with that committee, with your supervisor. If you have a Christian supervisor, wow, that's really neat. Don't pour your heart out necessarily on every single thing when you write your thesis, and be extra diligent about your disciplines and being involved in a church where the scripture is preached, etc. That's kind of scattershot, but there you go.
Well, the other thing too, I mean, he said don't pour your heart out, but don't necessarily put your heart in. I mean, you have a critical faculty, and the Lord is if you are staying grounded, right? You can read and understand where the limits are, right? When you what Brad was saying about you're going to get to a point where what is theorized, or what the theory that you're working at, or the phenomena that you're looking at, you know it can be understood in different perspectives. And it's important to be careful and learn to read interdisciplinarily, to read what counts as evidence in this perspective, and weigh that discern that against what counts as evidence in your perspective, but you can't use the Bible as a peer-reviewed source text, even though it was probably extensively peer-reviewed. But so in other words, you're learning to speak different languages and to recognize what you can say in a language and how close it gets to truth, but then where it has to stop. And you can be skeptical about that. You don't have to come to a conclusion. You can say, under this light, this is what this looks like. Under this light, it looks very different.